On the first day of April 1945, United States forces invaded Okinawa, and that battle became the clearest warning of what a direct invasion of Japan might cost. For months later, on the 6th day of August 1945, a single American bomber released a single atomic weapon over Hiroshima, and in less time than it takes to draw a breath, a functioning city became a burning ruin filled with the wounded and the dying. The strike did not end the war in that instant, but it cracked the final structure of Japan's resistance, reshaped the political calculations of every major power, and opened the nuclear age with the suffering of ordinary people who had no say in the decisions. That brought the bomb to their streets. Subscribe to the channel if you want more documentary stories told clearly, fully, and without fluff, because from here the story is the complete chain. The battles that cornered Japan, the secret project that built the bomb, the targets chosen, the morning of the mission, the aftermath inside the destroyed city, the second strike, the Soviet entry into the war, and the internal fight in Tokyo that finally ended the Second World War. To understand why Hiroshima happened, you have to start with the reality of the Pacific War. By the spring and summer of 1945, Japan had begun the conflict with rapid expansion across Asia and the Pacific. But years of fighting had reversed the momentum. The United States and its allies had forced Japan into a shrinking perimeter, capturing islands, cutting supply lines, and bringing long-range bombers within reach of the home islands. The Japanese Navy had been hammered, its carrier arms shattered, its fuel reserves strangled, and its ability to protect merchant shipping nearly broken. Submarines sank freighters and tankers at a pace Japan could not replace. Mines and air attacks made ports dangerous. Factories lacked raw materials. Trains ran under constant threat. Food grew scarce in many areas, and the government imposed rationing that tightened month after month. Above all, Japan's cities were becoming targets in a new kind of air war. Incendiary raids had already shown what mass fire could do to densely built neighborhoods. Wooden homes and narrow streets turned into fuel, and once fires joined, the heat and wind could create a citywide inferno. Entire districts vanished. Families crowded into shelters, then emerged to find nothing left but ash and twisted metal. Yet even as the destruction climbed, Japan's leadership did not move as a single unit toward surrender. The government was divided, the military held immense influence, and the country's political culture treated the idea of unconditional surrender as a kind of national annihilation. Many decision-makers believed that if Japan could make any invasion of the home islands catastrophically expensive, the United States might accept something less than total capitulation. Okinawa was the turning point that made those calculations feel urgent for the Americans and terrifying for the Japanese. The island was close enough to the home islands to serve as a staging base for air power and a springboard for future landings. The invasion began in early April. The fighting turned into a long, brutal campaign of trenches, caves, artillery, rain, mud, and relentless bombardment. Japanese defenders fought from prepared positions and often refused to surrender. Kamikaze attacks struck the fleet in waves, ripping ships open and killing sailors by the thousands. The United States ultimately won, but at enormous cost. Okinawa also became a disaster for civilians trapped between armies, suffering hunger, crossfire, coercion, and panic. When Okinawa ended, planners on both sides looked toward the main islands and saw a future that could be far worse. In Washington, military planners had already been building a blueprint for invading Japan. The concept was massive, an initial assault to seize parts of southern Japan, then a later drive toward the Tokyo region. The logistical scale was staggering, and the casualty estimates that circulated among leaders varied widely. But the shared theme was grim. Even the lower projections suggested losses. Unlike anything the American public had seen in the Pacific, Japanese planners, meanwhile, prepared for a final defense that would draw on the military, the police, and civilians trained and mobilized in different ways. Japan still had millions of men under arms across Asia and on the home islands. Even with shortages of fuel and modern equipment, Japan could concentrate defenders where it mattered most: on the beaches, in the mountains behind them, and in the skies with remaining aircraft prepared for suicide missions. At the same time, another project was reaching completion in deep secrecy. For years, the United States had poured enormous resources into building an atomic weapon. Scientists proved the physics, engineers built the production systems, and the military designed a delivery capability. That effort culminated in a successful test in mid-summer 1945. The weapon was no longer a theory. It was a working device capable of releasing a force beyond any conventional bomb. The moment it became real, the central question changed. It was no longer, can this be done? It became, how will this be used and to what end? The strategic situation in July 1945 was also shaped by alliance politics. The Soviet Union had remained neutral toward Japan for much of the Pacific War, but Allied leaders expected the Soviet Union to enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat. By late summer, Soviet entry was imminent. American leaders understood that Soviet involvement would increase pressure on Japan, but it would also shape the post-war balance in Asia. Who would occupy territory? Who would influence governments? And who would claim spoils were not abstract questions. They were already being negotiated in the shadows of military planning. Ending the war quickly mattered not only because people were dying every day, but also because the end would define the political map that followed. In late July, the Allied powers issued a demand for Japan's surrender. It warned of destruction if Japan refused. It also promised that Japan could rebuild if it accepted the terms, but the demand was still effectively unconditional. Within Japan's leadership, the declaration landed amid deep internal conflict. Some leaders sought a way out, but wanted to preserve the imperial institution and avoid occupation on harsh terms. Some believed the war could still be continued to secure better conditions. Some hoped the Soviet Union could mediate a compromise, not understanding that Soviet entry was already being prepared. Japan's outward response did not accept surrender, and the war continued. By this stage, the United States had several ways to continue pressing Japan: continued incendiary raids, continued blockade, continued conventional bombing of industry, and the looming invasion. Yet American leaders believed time was not neutral. Every week the war continued meant more Allied and Japanese deaths across the Pacific and Asia. More prisoners dying in camps, more civilians dying in bombed cities, more soldiers dying on isolated islands, more hunger spreading. The pressure to end the war fast was intense. The atomic bomb appeared to offer a way to force a decision. Without landing hundreds of thousands of troops on the beaches of Japan, targets for the atomic bomb were not chosen randomly. The military wanted a target where the weapon's impact would be dramatic and where the result could be assessed. It wanted a city that still has significant built-up areas and strategic value, and it preferred clear conditions for visual aiming. Hiroshima fit those criteria. It was a major city with military and industrial significance. It had not been destroyed to the same extent as some other cities, which meant the bomb's effects would be visible and measurable. That also meant many civilians remained there, living and working, trying to survive the war as best they could. This is one of the darkest parts of the story. The same logic that sought a clear demonstration of power also ensured that a large civilian population would be inside the blast zone. The mission was planned with careful attention to weather and timing. A specially prepared bomber crew trained for this operation. Escort and observation aircraft accompanied the mission. On the morning of the 6th day of August 1945, the aircraft approached Hiroshima under a clear sky. In the city below, life continued as usual for a society living under constant war strain. People went to factories, offices, and depots. Students were involved in labor. Families tried to secure food. Air raid warnings had become a part of routine life, and sometimes warnings ended without an attack, leaving behind a dull exhaustion that made people less likely to treat every alarm as the start of disaster. Then the bomb detonated above the city. The first sensation for those close enough was a flash brighter than anything they had ever imagined. It overwhelmed the eye and seared itself into vision. In that same instant, a burst of heat radiated outward with a violence that turned clothing into flame and exposed skin into burns. The temperature near the center reached a level that could ignite materials instantly: wood, paper, and fabric caught fire. In some areas, flesh was burned so deeply that people died immediately. The shock wave followed the thermal pulse, slamming into buildings and bodies with crushing force. Windows became clouds of sharp fragments, walls collapsed, roofs lifted and fell. People were thrown, crushed, pinned under debris. Entire streets changed shape in seconds, as structures that had defined the city simply vanished. What was left, standing near the center, was often stripped down to skeletal frames. Reinforced concrete buildings could remain upright in part, but their interiors were destroyed. Wooden houses, common in many neighborhoods, were obliterated or turned into fuel. Fires sprang up everywhere. Small flames merged into larger ones, and then into a mass of fire so wide that it created its own weather. Air rushed toward the center as oxygen was consumed, creating strong winds that fed the flames and drove burning embers into new areas. People who survived the blast could still die in the following hours as the firestorm spread, consuming streets and shelters. The city's medical system collapsed almost instantly. Many hospitals and clinics were destroyed or damaged. Doctors and nurses were killed or injured. Medical supplies burned. Roads were blocked by rubble. Communication systems failed. In the first hours, the wounded moved in waves, stumbling, crawling, carrying children, carrying parents, carrying strangers. Many had severe burns that covered large portions of their bodies. Some had burns so deep that skin hung loose or was gone entirely. Others were cut open by glass and splinters. Some were crushed under collapsed roofs and could not be freed. Rivers filled with people seeking relief from heat and flames. Some drowned. The weak to stay above water or died as the water around them filled with debris and bodies. There were injuries unlike those produced by ordinary bombing, and one of the most terrifying was invisible. Radiation from the blast penetrated bodies and disrupted blood and tissue in ways the victims could not understand. In the first day, many survivors looked shockingly intact compared with the burned and crushed around them, but then they grew sick. They vomited. Fevers rose. Weakness deepened. Bleeding began in some cases as the body systems failed. Hair fell out. Mouths and throats ulcerated. People who seemed likely to recover suddenly deteriorated and died. This new category of suffering did not fit the normal language of wartime injury. It confused survivors, overwhelmed medical workers, and expanded the death toll far beyond the moment of detonation. In the early aftermath, Hiroshima was not only destroyed, it was isolated. The city's ability to report clearly to Tokyo was damaged. At first, Japanese authorities understood that something catastrophic had happened, but the mechanism was not immediately certain. Reports arrived of a single bomb causing a level of destruction that normally required many waves of aircraft. As reconnaissance confirmed the scale, the conclusion became unavoidable. The city had been struck by a new weapon. This should have forced an immediate decision, but Japan's internal leadership structure was not built for quick agreement in a crisis that demanded it. The government and military leadership was divided into factions with different priorities. Some believed surrender was necessary to prevent the complete destruction of Japan. Others believed surrender was unacceptable and that the war must continue, at least long enough to secure conditions that could preserve national institutions and avoid what they feared would be humiliation and occupation on harsh terms. Some hoped the Soviet Union might still act as an intermediary, not realizing that Soviet plans were already moving toward attack. While Japan struggled to interpret Hiroshima, the strategic clock accelerated. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in early August. Its forces struck Japanese positions in Asia with overwhelming power. This was a shock of a different kind. Japan now faced not only the United States and its allies, but also a massive Soviet offensive that threatened to rip apart Japan's remaining military position on the Asian mainland. Any fantasy of Soviet mediation evaporated. The war was closing from multiple directions at once, and the options narrowed to a point. Then came the second atomic strike. On the 9th day of August 1945, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki after weather interfered with plans for the primary target of that mission. Nagasaki's terrain shaped the pattern of destruction, but the outcome was still catastrophic: intense blast damage, fires, and mass casualties. The message was clear. Hiroshima was not an isolated event. Japan could not assume that the destruction would stop, and each day of delay might mean another city erased. Now the internal struggle in Tokyo reached a breaking point. The highest councils debated, deadlocked, argued, and returned to the same wall. Surrender meant accepting terms that many could not bear, but continuing meant exposing the nation to repeated destruction and eventual invasion, alongside Soviet advances that could lead to partition or deeper collapse. In the end, the decision was pushed through by the rare intervention of the emperor, whose authority carried symbolic weight in a system that often shielded him from direct political choices. He supported accepting surrender with the hope of preserving the imperial institution in some form. Even that was not the end of danger. There were elements within the military that resisted surrender so fiercely, they considered stopping it by force. In the final hours before the surrender announcement, conspirators attempted to seize control and prevent the broadcast, believing that surrender would be a betrayal. The attempt failed. But the fact that it happened shows how unstable Japan's internal situation had become. The war ended not only because external forces broke Japan's capacity to continue, but also because internal forces finally overcame the last resistance to accepting defeat. When the surrender was announced, it did not reverse Hiroshima. It did not restore the dead or heal the burned. It did not immediately solve the hunger and ruin across Japan, but it did stop the expansion of the catastrophe. For Hiroshima's survivors, the world after the bomb was a place of rubble and grief, but also a place where the killing could stop. They began digging through ruins for family members. They searched for water, for food, for shelter. They built makeshift clinics. They carried the injured on doors and boards. They buried bodies in mass graves when individual burial was impossible. They tried to rebuild life while living with injuries that would never fully leave them. Hiroshima also became something more than a destroyed city. It became a symbol of what atomic warfare means. In real human terms, the survivors, often called habakusha, carried scars, illness, and social stigma. Many suffered long-term health consequences, including increased risks of certain cancers and chronic conditions. Some faced discrimination because others feared radiation or believed they were permanently sick. Families struggled with trauma that did not fade with time. Children grew up hearing stories of the morning the sky turned white. The question you asked earlier, why did they do it, has multiple layers, and the documentary answer has to hold them together without pretending there was only one motive. The primary stated motive was to end the war quickly and avoid the enormous casualties expected from invasion. American leadership believed Okinawa previewed the horror of fighting on Japan's home soil. They believed continued conventional bombing and blockade might still take months and still cost immense numbers of lives, including the lives of prisoners and civilians. From that perspective, the atomic bomb was framed as a brutal tool to force surrender sooner. But there was also the strategic and political layer, where the timing of the war's end mattered for the post-war balance. Soviet entry into the war was already shaping the map of Asia. Ending the war before the Soviet Union could occupy more territory mattered to American leaders, who were already thinking beyond the surrender toward the political future. Demonstrating overwhelming power also mattered in a world where post-war relationships were being formed and tested. The atomic bomb was not only a weapon against Japan, it was also a signal about technological dominance and the willingness to use it. There was also momentum, the force of a gigantic project built at enormous cost and secrecy. Once the bomb existed, not using it required a decision as weighty as using it. Some argued for a demonstration on an uninhabited area, but leaders worried that a demonstration might fail, or that Japan might not surrender anyway, or that it would give Japan time to prepare or disperse. Others believed a shock that could not be ignored was necessary. In the mindset of wartime leadership, the desire for a decisive result often overwhelms the instinct for restraint. None of this removes the central moral fact that makes Hiroshima unforgettable. The bomb destroyed a city where most of those killed and injured were civilians. It did not discriminate between soldier and child, between someone who supported the war and someone who privately opposed it. The weapon's design and the chosen method of use made such discrimination impossible. That is why Hiroshima remains one of the most disputed decisions in modern history. Some argue it shortened the war and saved lives by avoiding invasion and prolonged bombing. Others argue across an ethical boundary that can never be justified that alternatives existed, and that the deliberate targeting of a city with a weapon of mass destruction was fundamentally wrong. The documentary truth is that the decision happened in a world of intense pressure, fear, uncertainty, and strategic calculation, and the consequences were carried by ordinary people who did not sit in those rooms. To keep the narrative grounded, you have to watch the clock of 1945 and see how it tightened around Japan. In early summer, Japan's capacity to fight was collapsing in material terms, but its political willingness to surrender was still blocked. The military feared loss of honor and feared internal upheaval. Leaders feared what unconditional surrender would mean for the emperor and for the structure of society. They also feared war crimes trials and occupation. Some believed they could still force better terms by causing massive American casualties. Meanwhile, American leaders feared the cost of invasion, feared the political cost of a long war after Germany's defeat, and feared the consequences of letting the Soviet Union shape too much of the post-war settlement in Asia. Inside Hiroshima, none of these calculations mattered at the moment the bomb detonated. What mattered was that human beings were caught in an environment that turned lethal in seconds. People who were at work vanished. People in streetcars were burned alive. Children were separated from parents in the chaos. Families searched the ruins and found only fragments. Survivors described walking through streets where the city was still burning, stepping around bodies, hearing cries for water, seeing skin hanging from hands and arms, seeing eyes swollen shut. Many survivors were so thirsty they drank from rivers contaminated by ash and debris. Many died along the river banks, too weak to move, their final moments spent in heat and smoke. One of the most haunting details of Hiroshima is how ordinary life left traces in extraordinary ruin. The outlines of people were burned onto steps and walls, not because the person remained, but because the flash bleached surfaces around them, leaving a shadow where the body blocked the light. Everyday objects were fused or melted: bottles, roof tiles, metal fixtures. Watches stopped at moments that later became symbols of the time of detonation, even though many stopped for different reasons. The city's landmarks became reference points in a landscape that had lost its familiar shape. As days passed, the scale of death became clearer. Many died immediately in the blast zone. Many died in the first hours from burns, trauma, and fires. Many died later from infections and radiation sickness. The number of dead grew not as a single count, but as a rolling wave of loss. Survivors who searched for relatives often found only charred remains or nothing at all. In some cases, families identified loved ones by small objects, by a piece of clothing, by a ring, by a scrap of bone. In a disaster of that magnitude, grief does not come as a single moment. It comes in repeated discoveries, repeated failures to find, repeated confirmations that someone is gone. Japan's surrender did not instantly reveal the full long-term consequences of radiation exposure. Those consequences unfolded over years. Some survivors developed leukemia and other cancers at elevated rates. Some suffered chronic fatigue, scarring, and organ damage. Women who were pregnant at the time of the bomb worried about their children's health, and some children exposed in the womb faced severe outcomes. The social stigma added another layer of suffering. People feared that survivors carried contamination, or that they would be unable to work, or that they would bring illness into marriages. Survivors carried not only their injuries, but also a burden of being treated as different. Hiroshima's reconstruction began in ruins. Clearing rubble was dangerous. Infrastructure had to be restored: water, electricity, roads, housing. The economy had to restart. Schools had to reopen. Families had to find ways to live without the dead. Memorials emerged not only as monuments, but as a way for survivors to insist that the world recognize what happened. Commemorations formed, and the city's identity gradually incorporated the role of witness, not as an exercise in endless mourning, but as a warning. When historians and military analysts examine Hiroshima, they often focus on decision points and alternatives. Could Japan have surrendered without the bomb? Would the Soviet entry alone have forced surrender? Would continued blockade and conventional bombing have ended the war soon enough? Would a demonstration strike have worked? Would a modification of surrender terms, especially regarding the emperor, have produced the same result earlier? These questions remain debated because the evidence can support different interpretations, and because the moral weight of the event pulls people toward conclusions that fit their values. What is not debated is that Hiroshima changed everything. It showed that a single weapon could produce destruction on a city scale, and it introduced a new kind of fear into international politics. The fear that future wars could erase urban life in minutes. The story also forces a hard look at how modern war evolves. By 1945, the line between military and civilian suffering had already been blurred by strategic bombing, blockade, and total mobilization. Cities were not only homes, they were industrial hubs, transportation networks, and administrative centers. War planners treated them as systems to be broken. Hiroshima became the most extreme expression of that logic, compressing what might have taken many raids into a single detonation. In that sense, the atomic bomb was not a separate moral universe from the firebombing of cities, but it was an escalation so massive that it created a category of its own. After the surrender, the occupation of Japan began. The Japanese military was disarmed. Reforms reshaped political structures. Trials addressed war responsibility. Japan's society faced the task of rebuilding under new conditions. Hiroshima's survivors lived through this transformation while carrying injuries that were visible and invisible. The city, once a military and industrial center, became a focal point for conversations about peace and nuclear weapons. Even as the world quickly entered an era of nuclear rivalry, that rivalry formed almost immediately. The Soviet Union accelerated its own atomic program. The United States expanded its arsenal. Nuclear weapons became central to military doctrine. The logic of deterrence grew, the idea that possessing catastrophic power could prevent its use, because fear would restrain leaders. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were invoked as warnings and as justifications. For some, they were proof that nuclear weapons are terrible to ever use again. For others, they were proof that nuclear weapons can end wars quickly. This split remains, and it rests on how people weigh human suffering against strategic outcomes. If you want a clear documentary summary in the simplest terms, it is this: Hiroshima happened because the United States believed it needed a decisive shock to force Japan to surrender and avoid a planned invasion that could kill vast numbers of people, and because the weapon existed and was ready at a moment when leaders felt the pressure of time, casualties, and geopolitical consequences. It happened at the end of the Second World War, when Japan's military position was collapsing, but its leadership was still divided about surrender. The bomb destroyed a city, killed and injured massive numbers of civilians, introduced radiation sickness into the world's vocabulary of war, and helped trigger the final political decisions that ended the conflict after a second bomb. Its Soviet entry made the situation impossible to deny. And the final point, the one that often gets lost when people argue the decision as a strategic chess move, is that the event was lived minute by human beings. It was a mother searching for her child in smoke. It was a doctor with no medicine choosing who might survive. It was a boy walking through fire looking for water. It was a woman sitting in ruins, holding a burned hand, watching the city still burn into the night. It was survivors who lived long enough to grow old, still remembering the flash and the wind and the screams, still living with scars and sickness, still carrying a grief that did not belong to history books, but to the streets where they once walked. If you want, in the next message I can also add a second connected chapter in the same style, about the internal surrender crisis in Tokyo, with the attempted military resistance and the exact sequence that led to the surrender broadcast, written as one continuous documentary text as well.